Russia is the most sanctioned nation in history, fighting a disastrous war in Ukraine that seems set to remain a ruinous and bloody stalemate. And everyone from separatists to terrorists has smelled blood in the water, with multiple very successful attacks inside of the Russian Federation itself. Is Russia really on the brink of collapse, or could it pull itself back together? There are historical parallels between the Russian Federation and the USSR before it, and some have been far too quick to draw on these parallels as proof that Putin and Russia are gearing up for an ultimate collapse. The question of whether Russia can survive the next few years hinges on a variety of factors, and on knowing the difference between the Russia of today and the Soviet Union that preceded it. The most obvious parallel is the war in Ukraine, which mirrors Russia's adventurous campaign in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And exactly like the war in Afghanistan, this campaign too is proving to be a long, disastrous affair. But for proponents of the view that historical parallels do not mean Russia is gearing for collapse, the differences between Afghanistan and Ukraine are staggering. For one, the most obvious difference is the casualties. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up its failing communist government on December 24, 1979. The 40th Army was dispatched to fight what was expected to be a quick campaign against the Mujahideen forces. At the time, these were some of the Soviet Union's best forces, and the war would serve to both shore up its southern flank against the creep of anti-communist powers and be a display of military might to the rest of the world. Is this starting to sound familiar yet? In case it isn't, the campaign in Afghanistan quickly bogged down when the Mujahideen proved to be far more resilient than originally thought. The success of the Mujahideen forces in resisting the Soviet 40th Army quickly spurred the US and some of its partners to rush military aid into the conflict zone. History doesn't repeat, but it does like to rhyme. The war soon became asymmetrical, with the Soviet Union having military superiority, still failing to win any political objectives and bring a decisive end to the resistance. That part should sound familiar to Americans. The war would last for just over 9 years and result in the humiliating withdrawal of Soviet forces, along with 15,000 dead and 54,000 wounded. Here, the similarities between the conflicts stop altogether, because while an exact casualty count is difficult to ascertain, estimates tend to range at around 500,000 casualties after 2 years of fighting. What is verifiable is the fact that over 85,000 inheritance settlements for dead Russian soldiers have been recorded so far. Ukraine estimates that Russia has suffered nearly 500,000 casualties, with a third of those killed in action, while American and British intelligence both report over 300,000 casualties. What most sources agree on is that Russia has likely lost its entire initial invasion force by now. The casualty rate is staggering, and reports from behind the front lines in Ukraine, coupled with video evidence, tell that Russia is starting to bury its dead right there in Ukraine, rather than flying them home. It's also believed that Russia is purposefully delaying notifications of death to family members so as to avoid public outrage. There's evidence in social media of Russian families complaining about losing track of their men after being sent to the front and losing all contact. Many of these would go on to discover weeks or even months later that their loved one had died on the front. Why is Russia taking so many more casualties in a fraction of the amount of time, though? There are multiple factors at play here, the most obvious one being that, unlike Afghanistan, Ukraine is an industrial war. Here, two armies are meeting on the battlefield and deploying weapons at an industrial rate. Afghanistan, meanwhile, was an asymmetric conflict, with fighting kept at a constant but low intensity. The Mujahideen were unable to introduce heavy weaponry due to Russia's overwhelming superiority. American military aid in both conflicts is also dramatically different. In Afghanistan, aid was kept to small arms and man-portable air defenses, things that could be discreetly disseminated and carried around the countryside by the Mujahideen forces. Famously, the Stinger air defense weapon would be instrumental in shutting down Russia's tactic of overwhelming skirmishes with Mujahideen forces by utilizing highly mobile air assault troops. But this pales in comparison to the types of weapons the US can provide to Ukraine and the devastation that they've wrought. Ukraine's ability to resist Russian military power has allowed the US and its allies to send large amounts of heavy equipment to assist the Ukrainian armed forces. This has included M777 howitzers equipped with cluster munitions, and GPS-guided shells. The latter used to devastating results until Russian electronic warfare dropped their accuracy down to below 10%. HIMARS are probably the most famous weapon system of the war, and with good reason. The high-mobility artillery system has allowed Ukraine to utilize a force of less than 40 of those units to absolutely devastate Russian forces. There have been multiple incidents by now of entire Russian units wiped out with a single strike by several Gimler's rockets, including units deep in the rear, which made the mistake of falling into morning formation, not realizing they were under the watchful eye of a Ukrainian drone. The most famous of these strikes might just be the destruction of the Professional Technical School No. 19 in Makiivka in the Donetsk Oblast. At exactly 11:57 p.m. on December 31, 2022, Ukraine fired a volley of Gimler's rockets from a HIMARS battery, followed by another volley 2 seconds later and a third volley a second after that. Shortly after, the rockets would destroy the technical school where hundreds of Russian soldiers, many of them fresh conscripts, were being housed. Estimates on casualties vary greatly, with Ukraine claiming the attack had killed between 400 and 500, with another 300 wounded. Russia, meanwhile, said only 63 had died, updating it to 89 2 days later. An intercepted phone call between a Russian soldier and his wife back home put the estimate somewhere in the hundreds, with the soldier remarking that he'd seen hundreds of bodies loaded onto trucks from the rubble. With the truth somewhere in between, Russia's casualties are the worst seen since the end of the Second World War, and this has put serious strain on the Russian Federation and Putin. War weariness helped drive an end to the Afghanistan venture, similar to how it ended the US's involvement in Vietnam. In today's Ukraine war weariness is driving some instability in the Russian Federation. But for proponents of the theory that Russia is close to collapse, it bears a closer look. During the Afghanistan war, Soviet mothers launched a successful campaign that helped end the war. However, Vladimir Putin has much greater and tighter control over the Russian Federation than Mikhail Gorbachev ever did over the Soviet Union. Putin has created a very carefully crafted propaganda state that has pushed his agenda and cult of personality for over 2 decades, and his control over Russian media has allowed him to obfuscate the true scope of the disaster in Ukraine for most of the Russian people. As a matter of fact, Putin's control over the Russian state bears the task of helping dispel false historical comparisons. Mikhail Gorbachev never truly established control over senior Soviet leaders, with whom he was frequently at odds. He also failed to enact personal control over the larger Soviet bureaucracy, securing key allies into positions of power and building his own base of power from there. With only 6 years in office, Gorbachev failed to establish dominion over the Soviet instruments of power. Vladimir Putin, however, is another story altogether. Putin's start as a Russian dictator-in-chief was launched off a clever false flag attack meant to ingratiate himself to the Russian people. In 1999, Boris Yeltsin named Putin his successor. Yeltsin needed to ensure that a political ally would take power after him to avoid potential corruption charges. The problem was, nobody knew who Vladimir Putin was at the time, but he had a plan to change that. Utilizing the Russian FSB, Putin enacted a false flag attack blamed on Chechen terrorists, targeting Russian apartment buildings in Moscow, which ended with the death of over 300 civilians. Putin pinned the blame on the Chechen terrorists and vowed to bring them to justice. This immediately skyrocketed his popularity and garnered him the popular support needed to win the Russian election. Since then, Putin's been at work for over 24 years, carefully cultivating the instruments of his own power. He has significantly eroded any checks and balances and replaced any potential adversaries with political allies. Recognizing that real reins of power in Russia lay with the oligarchs, Putin made it clear in a series of corruption investigations that he would tolerate no dissent from the rich elite of Russia. To get around the Russian constitution that forbids presidents from seeking a third consecutive re-election, Putin put his personal sock puppet, Dmitry Medvedev, into power for a single term, resetting his political clock and allowing him to run for 2 more terms. In 2020, he created constitutional amendments passed by both the upper and lower chambers of parliament that effectively reset his political clock yet again, allowing him to run for president again in 2024, which he naturally won, and once more in 2030. Putin has successfully remained in power for 24 years and could remain in power for another 12 years, making him the longest-lasting Russian leader in its modern history. His control over the levels of Russian power is absolute, which allowed him to pass a sweeping set of laws shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, which effectively silenced any opposition to him, his policies, or the war itself. Protesters in Russia can now face a variety of punishments, including stiff jail sentences, for any sentiment seen as anti-war, a tool he's used to destroy any political resistance to his rule and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Once in prison, these individuals can even find themselves drafted to go fight in Ukraine, and like most prisoners sent to fight, their fate is all but assured. A study of Wagner's casualties in the Battle of Bakhmut showed that 2/3 of all prisoners sent to fight there died. Of the 20,000 Wagner casualties in Bakhmut, a full 17,000 of them were prisoners. And yet, not even Putin can whitewash the effect that ongoing casualties are having on Russia and its future. Even without war casualties, Russia has experienced a massive brain drain, with a loss of approximately 1 million people from the country since the war began. That's created a huge labor shortage in the country, especially in the tech sector, where an estimated 100,000 IT professionals have left their jobs and moved abroad. In 2023, 42% of Russia's industrial enterprises faced a worker shortage, a new record for the country. The hardest-hit industries were manufacturing, industrial, mining, and transportation. A real concern for a country where industry and mining make up a lopsided percentage of the Russian GDP. An estimated 2,500 high-level scientists have left the country, resulting in what's being called an intellectual disaster for the country. However, even worse than this are the sanctions imposed on the country, which have shut down cooperative efforts between Russian researchers and many global counterparts. For instance, the Michigan Institute of Technology had a joint research effort in Skolkovo, but that was terminated after Russia invaded Ukraine. Russian scientists have also been cut off from Western scientific journals, which means they can't publish their work for peer review abroad. This lack of review results in scientific stagnation and a lack of innovation. Russia has also been cut off from joint scientific endeavors, which are on the cutting edge of modern research. Projects like the Large Hadron Collider, for instance, require international cooperation due to their cost and complexity. But Russian science can no longer benefit from cooperation in those endeavors. There's also been a massive exodus of capital from Russia. Along with their expertise, Russians who fled after the invasion of Ukraine took their savings with them, and it was wealthier Russians who could afford to leave in the first place. This resulted in an estimated 11.5% of all personal savings in Russian banks being transferred abroad in 2022, amounting to $41.5 billion that has left the Russian economy. This loss of capital means fewer Russians investing in Russian businesses, leading to a drop in the overall economy. Compounding Russia's problems is a low birth rate combined with a lack of imagination into the country. Russia's been attempting to rectify this by luring in migrants from abroad, though increasingly it's funneled those personnel toward the front lines of Ukraine. Its long-time relationship with India has begun to sour after Russian agents were discovered to be running a human trafficking network inside of India, funneling desperate Indians into Russia and luring them in with promises of citizenship and good jobs. Those good jobs, however, turned out to be in the military, which, to Russia's credit, has been offering extremely lucrative contracts both at home and abroad for anyone willing to join, pay packets that are finally comparable with what U.S. service members receive on average. The clever bit, however, is that Russia is not paying out those pay packets up front. Rather, they're paid out over the course of an enlistment. These personnel are inevitably funneled straight to the front lines, a coldly calculated move to ensure that most of them become casualties, so Russia doesn't have to pay out in full. The mass exodus of Western businesses from Russia is also fueling its instability. The nation lost tens of billions of dollars in foreign investment after the war, both in capital and hardware. Some companies had little choice but to simply leave their hardware behind, with Russian authorities promptly confiscating it. Multiple airlines were forced to leave passenger aircraft behind in Russia, and despite requesting that the planes be returned to them, Russia's refused. This has significantly soured Western businesses from conducting business in Russia, even after the war is over and sanctions were lifted. Businesses do not like unpredictable and overreaching regimes that can threaten their assets at any time, making Russia an incredibly unattractive investment opportunity, even if all sanctions were to be immediately lifted. The hardest hit by sanctions is Russia's medical and energy sector. Shortly after the war began, Russia began to run out of critical cancer drugs, leading to a spike in mortalities. Since then, Russia's worked to either dodge global sanctions outright or work with China to circumvent them. Russia's energy sector, however, has been ravaged by sanctions, with Western capital making up a significant amount of capital investments into Russian gas and oil operations, expansion of existing facilities, and the digging of new exploratory wells. Even basic maintenance has been affected, with Russia relying on Western technology for much of its energy infrastructure, technology that Russia does not have the technical expertise to produce domestically. Compounding this problem is an aggressive drone campaign by Ukraine targeting Russian energy production and exports. This has led to a ban on foreign gasoline sales that Russia has pretended is merely aligning with OPEC policies, but in truth is necessary due to a dramatic disruption of Russian energy production. Not all of the harm to its industry comes from sanctions. Gazprom initially cut off natural gas to Europe as a way to blackmail the EU against supporting Ukraine. Even before sanctions were implemented, Putin hoped that Europe's reliance on Russian natural gas would give him the leverage needed to bend Europe to his will. In fact, President Barack Obama was already warning Germany back in the 2010s that they were overly reliant on Russian energy and were giving Vladimir Putin all the rope he needed to hang them. German Chancellor Angela Merkel laughed his concerns off, claiming that America was stuck in a Cold War mentality. She instead pursued a policy of engaging Russia economically, believing that mutual trade would prove too beneficial for Russia to throw away, encouraging other European powers to follow suit. Merkel's policy led to a disastrous coupling to Russian energy, one that would lead to an extremely painful decoupling in 2022. Russia's attempt to blackmail Europe by cutting off natural gas backfired spectacularly. They believed that Westerners were soft and too accustomed to their prosperity to risk it in order to foil his plans in Ukraine. This proved extremely wrong, with alternate sources of energy quickly being exploited. The biggest problem for Russia is that its natural gas market was almost entirely dependent on European consumption, given the difficulty in transporting it and Russia's lack of facilities to liquefy it for transport abroad via ships. The nation continues to struggle to replace its lost revenue stream, especially given that much of the technology needed to build plants for export would have to come from Western firms. Russia's oil industry, the most important sector of its economy, has weathered sanctions far better, but it's still suffering greatly. European price caps have made Russian oil barely profitable, with Russia forced to sell very close to a break-even point. To make matters worse, nations like China and India have exploited Russia's desperation by demanding steep discounts. So, despite dramatically ramping up exports to the two countries, Russia's revenue stream has continued to shrink. Yet, Russia has needed to make up for its shrinking budget somewhere, and thus took to taxing oil revenues using Brent crude prices rather than Urals prices. This meant that Russia is in effect cannibalizing its own energy industry, as the already slim profits leave even less money available for investing in the expansion of operations, digging new wells, or even basic maintenance. Ukraine's drone campaign has only made matters worse, adding to Russia's economic insecurity and an extremely unpredictable future. So far, though, Russia is staving off a collapse due to the artificial buoying of its economy. At the start of the war, Russia had an estimated $612 billion in foreign reserves, with just under half of that, $300 billion, held in Western banks. Those funds were immediately frozen, but it still left Russia with a sizable reserve it could liquidate, and it's been doing this to fund the war in Ukraine and prop up its own economy. The National Wealth Fund alone, or the parts that could be liquidated easily and were worth about $100 billion at the start of the invasion, was nearly half spent by the start of 2024. The total holdings of the National Wealth Fund fell by 12% in the same period of time, with heavy subsidies going directly into the economy to stave off the effects of sanctions. An estimated 2 trillion rubles were used to buy holdings in Russian companies and infrastructure bonds, and another 3 trillion rubles went straight to funding its 2023 budget deficit. If oil prices drop below $50 a barrel, some believe Russia will run its National Wealth Fund completely dry within 2 years. The escalating cost of the war in Ukraine, though, threatens to shrink that fund even faster. 2 points Ukrainian planners have taken note of as they target Russian energy infrastructure, despite President Joe Biden asking them to temporarily halt attacks in order to stabilize global oil prices. Some believe, however, that Russia can continue creating a safety margin for itself despite a $60 price for oil through investments in illiquid assets, and certainly Russian financial figures show that the country is struggling but not in immediate danger of collapse. Yet Russian figures have not had independent verification since the war started, and are largely considered to be completely faked for the sake of preventing panic at home and denying the world vital information that it could use to better target sanctions. Nonetheless, a shrinking budget on social spending could start producing serious unrest soon, especially as the nation reels from the staggering cost of caring for so many wounded and disabled by the war. Many have used the current economic troubles and drawn parallels to the Soviet Union's final days, yet this is a disingenuous comparison. The Soviet Union was essentially bankrupt at the time of its collapse, running large trade deficits and borrowing abroad. The Soviet economy was stagnant and had been for 2 decades, with Gorbachev refusing to implement proposed economic reforms that it was hoped would revitalize the Union. What little foreign trade it did was largely on a product-for-product basis, trading raw materials or energy for specific products. In 1988, Soviet and American trade delegations met to discuss how the two nations might expand trade relations. Soviet economic planners were hoping to learn management, marketing, and manufacturing skills from the American delegation, recognizing the dire state of their own economy. The planned Soviet economy and tight government control had failed, and it left the Soviet Union in a state of inevitable decline. While there are some parallels now, thanks to Russia's alienation on the world stage, the Russian economy itself is far more robust and healthier than it was during the Soviet times. While the Soviet-planned economy was extremely rigid and relied heavily on state subsidies, Russia has a capitalist economy that engages in global trade despite being the most sanctioned nation in history. Mobilization for the war has also helped the Russian economy, reversing downward trend indicators or at least freezing them in place. In 2023, Russia finally mobilized its industry for war, enacting a special government committee that oversaw domestic production. This committee had the power to directly manage any Russian businesses critical to the war effort and could even force the cancellation of vacation plans and order extended shifts. Now, many Russian arms producers are working 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. This manufacturing boom has been a shot in the arm for the flagging Russian economy. But it's a Potemkin village, because the Russian economy is now increasingly invested in producing war goods. These single-use items create zero market value and cannot function as an economic investment. Once a tank has been built, it doesn't generate value. In fact, it consumes value by demanding maintenance and fuel. The economic boom is a hollow one, and the moment the war is over or state budgets to purchase war goods run out, the boom becomes a collapse, thanks to a lack of investments elsewhere. With all the focus on war production, funds and entrepreneurs to invest in other businesses become scarcer. So while the Russian economy is fundamentally different from the Soviet one, it may eventually run into the same dead end as the Soviet economy, but not anytime soon. Putin's cash reserves must first be exhausted, and Ukraine is ensuring that happens sooner or later by targeting Russia's ability to produce and export energy. Another source of instability for Russia is tensions within its ethnic minorities. These tensions exploded recently with a series of terror attacks in the Dagestan region. Sensing weakness, Islamic separatists launched a violent campaign against local forces, throwing the region into chaos for several days. They may have failed in their objectives, but their failure is also a success, proving to other extremist or separatist forces that the Russian state has become weak enough to be challenged in its borderlands. Yet, Russia has taken steps to ensure it retains control over its ethnic minorities. These groups have been disproportionately targeted for recruitment and draft notices by the military. As Moscow knows, there will be less public unrest if casualties come from ethnic minority communities in remote Russia versus cosmopolitan and ethnic Russian cities like St. Petersburg. It's been labeled a silent ethnic cleansing. But for those populations, the large pay packets represent an irresistible opportunity. Often, the now increased military pay packages can equal several years' salary in rural Russia. The real trouble will come when Russia runs out of ethnic minorities to exploit and send to the front lines. Once casualties mount bad enough that it must turn to enacting drafts in major Russian territories, and those draftees in turn become casualties, the Russian state might start to see the type of instability one would have expected to occur by now. For the time being, though, Russia seems set to avoid a new draft, though many are alarmed at the fact that Russia has nearly exhausted its ability to recruit from prison populations, a key source of sacrificial combat power. Russia's staggering losses in its summer offensive only point to an even more pressing need for a new draft. The 83rd Airborne Brigade has recently suffered massive casualties, with Russian mill bloggers reporting that the entire unit has had to be pulled off the front for total reconstitution. A soldier from the elite Airborne Brigade even posted a video to social media stating that he was going to surrender, saying that he and his unit couldn't go on any longer and hadn't eaten or drank water in 3 days. He ended his video by imploring Russian youth not to join the military. The greatest threat to Russia and Vladimir Putin is always going to be internal. While it's tempting to look at all these events and conclude that Russia must be close to collapse, the truth is the Russian people have always had an unnatural tolerance for casualties. Putin's control over the population and the Russian power structures also seems resilient, able to weather the Wagner insurrection in the summer of 2023, when most thought that the regime might fall. Now check out why the world economy has no need for Russia, or watch this video instead.